The Memphis Grizzlies have entered the final week of the regular season. That means the playoffs are coming. And no disrespect to the Portland Trail Blazers or any other opponent the rest of the week. All eyes are ahead on the Memphis Grizzlies and their potential playoff run. Which players are most important to the Memphis Grizzlies going on said run and maybe surprising some folks given the way the season has played out to this point? We're going to talk about that on this episode of Locked On Grizzlies. Let's lock in.
You are Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another episode of Locked On Grizzlies. And don't worry, we're not, hanging out outside of murals or anything. We just have fancy new backgrounds here as part of Locked On Grizzlies. We are upping the ante as we get ready for postseason basketball. And of course, Damichael and I, after having a couple of days off at the end of last week, Damichael had a great show for Monday. I'm back, the dynamic duo, riding again on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Grizzlies. Thank you so much for listening, checking us out wherever you get your podcasts, as well as on YouTube. Like, comment, rate, review, subscribe, all those fun things. This episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Last-minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed over at Game Time. Again, we are proud members of the Locked On Podcast Network here at Locked On Grizzlies. And as I mentioned a moment ago, the playoffs are approaching. Make sure you're making Locked On NBA and all the great shows of our playoff teams in particular. All the programs are great, don't get me wrong, but obviously with the postseason approaching, making sure that you're checking out a potential playoff show or a playoff opponent show, those sorts of things, all very welcome here on Locked On Grizzlies. We're always your first listen, I know, but start checking out some of those other potential opponents for your second listens. I am Ja Morant of Bluff City Media. I also write for SB Nation and Fansided. I had an SB Nation piece on Monday previewing the crazy week ahead for the playoff contenders. I mentioned the Memphis Grizzlies a couple of times, joined by the wonderful Damichael Cole of the Commercial Appeal there in Memphis, Tennessee. And again, not literally, he's not sitting on the street, folks. It may look like he is, but he is not sitting on the street. He's just right there outside of FedEx Forum, his home away from home for 6 months or so of the year as he covers the Memphis Grizzlies as well as anybody there in Memphis, Tennessee. Damichael, it's good to see you, sir.
It's great to see you, Joe. It's great to have the duo back together. We got our nice little virtual backgrounds up here, and
you look good.
And thank you, Joe. And look, let me tell you something. You've been writing some good stuff lately, and
thank you.
And I'm starting to wonder. I know you're Grizzlies guy, but you're writing about a lot of other teams too, Joe. It's kind of confusing the fan base a little bit. You got this nice piece on the Kings, and where's your loyalty, Joe? Where are you?
Oh man, I'm sure there's lots of people that would wish I stopped writing about the Memphis Grizzlies. I've tried to spread my wings a little bit this year, Damichael. As you know, I left Grizzly Bear Blues last year to let Parker Fleming, who's done a phenomenal job. He has a great piece over at Bluff City Media from Monday about mental health in the Grizzlies that he's been working on a long time. So check that out. I highly recommend it over at Bluff City Media. But then GBB was released by Vox, who I can't make too much fun of because they still pay me, as I mentioned a moment ago. And now, they're a part of Bluff City Media, and Parker and Mark King, who runs Bluff City Media, old friend of mine, asked me to come on board again. So the Substack that I had is gone, and all my Grizzlies stuff is over at Bluff City Media. But again, with SB Nation in particular, I'm fluttering about spreading my wings. Here in a couple of weeks, I'm going to have to write like a playoff series thing for a team that's not the Grizzlies, which is going to be weird. But again, bluffcitymedia.co/join. Go use the promo code Mullinax, 10-day free trial, 10% off on an annual subscription, and you'll get my Grizzly stuff there. Your Grizzly stuff is fantastic, Damichael, over at the Commercial Appeal. And now that we've sucked up to each other for a couple of minutes, you wrote a great piece about, who mattered. You didn't talk about this. this episode is focusing on the guys that matter most for the Grizzlies playoff push. And the number one person to talk about in this episode is Ja Morant, right?
Right. Without a doubt.
Let's not reinvent the wheel here. Let's not try to be cute and say it's, David Roddy or Santi Aldama. The number one guy is Ja Morant. And you wrote a great piece over the Commercial Appeal. Highly recommend folks check it out if they haven't already done so. Talking about Ja Morant trying to rediscover that number one alpha. And it wasn't exactly that tone. I'll let you describe it because you wrote it. Yeah. You'll describe it better than me. But Ja trying to find himself as that number one option again, coming back from the suspension, the time away, however you want to describe it. There's been some growing pains there, I think it's fair to say. And he's trying to get that groove back, balancing the continued development of Jaren Jackson Jr. and Desmond Bane, who we'll talk about later in the show, with the fact that, at some point, if the Grizzlies want to go on a playoff run, no disrespect to anybody else on the roster, they're going to have to call 12 to win some games.
Yeah, and this time is different, and when I say that, we've seen the Grizzlies play without Ja and succeed. I mean, at one point, they were 16-2 last season when Tyus Jones was in the starting lineup at point guard. I mean, it was remarkable, right? It was one of the biggest stories of the season and how that was happening. But it has never felt like this. Talking to Ja in the locker room after the Clippers game on Friday, he kind of said something that, quite frankly, it caught me off guard because I'm used to, like you're used to, Joe. We're used to him doing this call 12 celebration and his teammates getting him the ball, and now it feels more like Ja is just trying to blend in. He's just, and the first example was I'll come off the bench, and then at the end of the day, you love the humility, right? Yeah, it is a dream to have a superstar who can put his ego to the side as a coach. I mean, as a coach, I'm sure you always want your star player to feel like he can mesh with the rest of the guys. But at the same time, you got to remember that you are the star player. Right. And Ja has never had a problem with that. But there's just, for example, recent comments after the Clippers game. He said, for me, it's getting used to pretty much not being the main option. Just finding my spots. We got Jaren and Des who have took over that role for us. For me, it's just getting them the ball, and when I get my chance, just take it. That sounds like a 3-and-D spot-up guy to me. Yeah. If I didn't know Ja Morant said that, I think it was Mikal Bridges with the Suns. Like that's how that sounds. But this is a guy who's averaging over 26 points per game. This is a guy who's had 40-point games. Mm-hmm. But I think he had 52 points in a game against the Spurs. This is a guy who's had 40-point playoff performances. Like, this is Ja Morant, And I get it because Jaren's playing the best basketball of his career. Offensively, especially, but defensively, he's been great for a while, but he's locked in, there as well. Dez, as we talked about, is having the ball in his hands more than ever. And he's running with that opportunity. Mm-hmm. He is shining with the ball in his hands. So now Ja is trying to figure out, okay, Dez needs the ball in his hands a little more. Jaren needs the ball a little more. How do I still be the same guy in the midst of this? And you know what? It's going to happen. It's going to figure it out. But guess what, Joe? It's only about a week until the play-in games start, and the Grizzlies will be playing a few days after that. So the clock is ticking.
I'm excited about those practices that they're going to be able to have while the play-in tournament is going on. That little mini break that has essentially become for the 12 true playoff teams. Obviously, 7 seed plays 8 seed, 9 seed plays 10 seed, and then the winner of 7-8 is the 7 seed. The loser of that game gets a second chance, right? And they will host whoever won the 9-10 game, and they will be the 8th seed after. Again, I love the play-in tournament. It's it's really taken off, in my opinion. Again, the Grizzlies are one of the founding fathers, so to speak, of the play-in tournament. They're the first team technically to ever win it, since they were the 9 seed, if I remember correctly, and then they found a way in.
Beat the Warriors.
Beating the Warriors. Yep. So, like I said, technically the founding fathers of the play-in. So I'm a fan of it. You mentioned that being said, like a 3-and-D guy. I'm going to tell you who it made me think of when I first read it. Tyus Jones. Like, that's something you expect Tyus Jones to say. And no disrespect to Tyus Jones. Tyus Jones isn't getting a max contract when his deal's up, right? So I think that as long as we continue to preface all this, and again, I mentioned Parker's piece on mental health a little while ago, that's still very much a thing for Ja. He's still working through that stuff, and he's going to continue to, and that continues to remain the priority, right? I don't think that anybody in Memphis would choose a playoff run this year over Morant's long-term health for a variety of reasons. Some selfish, some not selfish. You want to say you want that guy to be healthy for just being a good human being, but for the selfish reason of you just signed him to a 5-year max contract. So if this season is not it, you still have 5 more with this guy. You want him to find himself however long it takes him to find himself. But this can't be, again, no disrespect to Desmond Bane, Jaren Jackson Jr. We're going to talk more about them here later in the show. This is Ja Morant's team, and he needs to, whatever that process looks like for him, find that confidence again. And however long it takes, whatever they got to do, again, I'm not saying he needs to wake up or anything like that. Mental health is the priority here. I just really want to stress that. But this cannot be accepted as the new normal, if that makes sense. He has to find that balance at his own pace, no rush, but you're not the third option behind Desmond Bane and Jaren Jackson Jr. They're the options behind you. And him rediscovering that, I think, really is important, because when the game is tight against the Phoenix Suns, against the Minnesota Timberwolves, whoever it might be, Ja Morant's going to have the ball in his hands, not Jaren Jackson Jr., not Desmond Bane. He might pass to one of those guys if they're open, but it's going to start with Ja Morant, and he has to believe in himself to be able to make the right choice. And because of his absurdly wonderful talent, a lot of the times he's going to be the right choice. So Ja Morant, Damichael, and I are on the same page. Number one dude over the next several games heading into the playoffs needs to, we got to get some clarity on his situation. Another guy that we need some clarity on, we're going to talk about next here on Locked On Grizzlies. But first, this episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by Game Time, wonderful new sponsor here at Locked On Grizzlies. I don't know about you, Damichael, and you go to lots of Grizzlies games as work, right? So you don't have to buy a ticket. But when I have to go to games sometimes and I'm buying a ticket as a fan, I'm trying to find something for myself and my daughter, whatever the case might be, it can be stressful hunting down the best price in a last-minute sort of way. It shouldn't be stressful. Game Time allows for it to be faster and easier to buy tickets for all the sports, but not just sports, music, comedy, theater, whatever it might be near you. The Game app is extremely user-friendly. They have great details like deals and last-minute tickets. The way that your seat will actually look in terms of the view that you're going to have from that seat. They also guarantee the absolute lowest price, which is really cool. And I really am appreciative of that, as, again, somebody trying to buy tickets for more than myself now. That lowest price guarantee is extremely valuable. Snag the tickets without the stress at Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last-minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Steven Adams, our number 2 guy in terms of figuring out what the heck's going on. We're going to talk him next here on Locked On Grizzlies. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies, a wonderful Tuesday edition of the program. Joe Mullinax joined once again, finally, so happy to have the dynamic duo back together, me and Damichael Cole. Damichael, of course, writing over at the Commercial Appeal, my Grizzlies stuff over at Bluff City Media. And Damichael, I think that, we talked about Ja in the previous segment. We agree on Ja Morant being the, and again, you wrote an amazing piece over Commercial Appeal. He is still finding himself, right? And that matters. That's important. Again, I can't stress enough. Take your time, but the playoffs start next week, right? Number 2, similar kind of thing in a different way, mental health versus physical health. Steven Adams, they have, been very guarded, wanting to make sure he's 100% healthy. He's the oldest guy on the roster now, I believe, at 29 years old. So, knees start to go, especially when you're a large human. You don't want to rush those things. But again, you and I have talked considerably about how important Steven Adams is to
you
this
need him.
particular iteration of the team. Obviously, I believe it's Wednesday that we're expecting some sort of update. So tomorrow, hopefully, we will get something on Steven Adams potentially. If there's any insights you have on that, Damichael, obviously, please share them. But the way that he sets screens and creates so much space, we haven't seen him with Luke Kennard consistently yet. All the room that he's going to help Kennard get off ball screens. I can't wait to see Kennard run off a ball screen from Steven Adams and that guy just like fly into the fifth row. Where are you at in terms of the importance of Adams and his health going into these last few games of the season and the playoffs, of course, next week?
It's near the top of the list. He's
right behind Ja.
Yeah, he's very important. And we talk about how all these starters are important in their own way. But with Steven Adams, you mentioned it. The screen setting stands out, but the rebounding stands out the most. And what we've noticed since Steven Adams has left, I mean, the Grizzlies were number 1 in rebounding. I think they're down to 3rd now. And they've gotten out-rebounded by some small teams at times, where in games, it'd be like, oh, yeah, that team's going to have to play bigger. Like now the Grizzlies, teams aren't adjusting to the Grizzlies as much as the Grizzlies are adjusting to teams now. The Grizzlies are playing small more, and things like that. Whereas in the past, you play against Steven Adams, you got to play your big guys. You can try to go small, but you're going to get dominated. It's right there. You mentioned the screens for Luke Kennard, and I was talking to Luke Kennard about that the other day. I'm like, man, you haven't got a chance to get a screen from Steven Adams yet, and that is something with Xavier Tillman Sr. He wants to be just like Steven Adams in that area. Like I remember one game I was talking to X just about rebounding and scoring and all these things. And all he wanted to talk about was setting screens. And I'm like, you, Steven Adams, which
Steven is admirable.
Yeah, it's that leadership in a different way, right? So that's how important it is. Desmond Bane even told me, he and Luke Kennard have had conversations on how this guy sets screens, how that guy sets screens. When you're coming off curls at the 3-point line and you're coming from different actions and sets and whatnot. Here's how X sets his screens. Here's how you should adjust to this guy. And here's how it's the small intricacies that all trace back to Steven Adams. And all of these things are at their best when Steven Adams is in the game. You think of some of the reasons the Grizzlies have struggled. That game against the Bulls, for example. The Grizzlies dominated in the first half on the boards.
Yeah.
Didn't do the same in the second half. And I call Steven Adams a run stopper in a way, because when the Grizzlies were missing all those shots, they were turning the ball over a lot too, but when they were missing those shots, you can't tell me at one point Steven Adams would have grabbed the offensive rebound and boom, 2 points. He wouldn't have allowed a 17-0 run at the end of the third quarter. So yeah, I'm with you, Joe. Steven Adams is right up there. And the simplest for him is you're going to need him to kind of protect Jaren Jackson Jr. This doesn't get talked about enough. Jaren Jackson Jr. at the 5 is a lot more exposed in terms of fouls and things like that. Jaren Jackson Jr. at the 4, playing alongside of Steven Adams. Steven Adams is more exposed in those situations. Steven Adams doesn't foul nearly as much. So Steven Adams is more exposed, and Jaren Jackson Jr. can come from the weak side, can come, help and more things like that than the man-to-man situations where he's more prone to, the little ticky-tack fouls here and there. Steven Adams is a big factor in so many ways that the basic stats don't quantify.
I compare it to, and I have a background in football, I compare it to the offensive line, right? Like Steven Adams.
I was thinking that earlier. I was about to call him an offensive guard, but I like where you're going.
He is the protector, right? He is that physical force that the Grizzlies have missed. You don't mess with Steven Adams, right? Like Shannon Sharp doesn't even mess with Steven Adams. He lists every other Memphis Grizzlies player, but not Steven Adams. I think that with this Grizzlies team, they have a lot of skill. And we're going to talk more about, Jaren and Bane and some others in terms of their abilities being on display. They're developing those skill sets. Sometimes you just need a dude that's going to do the dirty work. right? And in football, you think about the big bomb touchdown pass, or you think the 80-yard touchdown run, the speed, the magnificent route that a receiver runs to get open. But you don't watch the 5 dudes that created that opportunity because they picked up the blitz, unless an analyst who's played the game points it out, right? So Steven Adams is very much that for these Grizzlies. He is the offensive line. He is the one who makes Ja Morant and Desmond Bane and Jaren Jackson Jr., for the reasons that you just outlined. He helps them tick. And when he is back, he will put those guys and others like Luke Kennard in a better position to have success, because they can go back to prioritizing the specific skills that they are good at or great at or elite at, and Adams can be the screen setter. Xavier Tillman is a good screen setter and a good rebounder. Letting him do that as a reserve as opposed to a starter, that's going to help X. So there's a lot of good opportunity for Adams to be that amplifier of what others do great or are elite at. He has a game that doesn't take away from what they're capable of offensively or defensively. He is an amplifier. He just makes it brighter and bigger and louder. And that's really valuable for a young team that needs that help still to this point. Your point on Jaren is spot on. I want Jaren to be the 5. That's what I want. I want him to be able to do that. I've wanted it since Jaren was drafted several years ago. He's not ready yet. He's just not ready to be that long-term 5. So you need Steven Adams, right? Because if you don't have him there, as we've seen, Jaren is still really good, but the foul issue in particular is louder when the silencer Steven Adams isn't there to help the mold. So we talked about Ja Morant, we talked about Steven Adams. In our final segment of the show today, this Tuesday, we're going to take a look at our number 3 most important player to the end of season playoff push, and obviously the playoffs themselves, which we'll talk more about. Damichael and I disagree on this one, which is nice, right? We always agree all the time, but this is a chance for us to have a little bit of a debate coming up next year on Locked On Grizzlies. But first, this episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. Think about a time where you've learned something new about yourself. What was that experience like for you? How did it change your life? Getting to know yourself can be a lifelong process, especially because we're always all growing and changing. Therapy is about deepening your self-awareness and understanding, and BetterHelp connects you with a licensed therapist who can take you on that journey of self-discovery from wherever you are. It's helpful to learn positive coping skills, how to set boundaries. It empowers you to be the best version of yourself. It's not just for people that have experienced major trauma. It is an enabling, powerful piece of self-development. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try and discover your potential with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. We're talking third and final, although there's plenty, of a player that needs to step up or who we're looking to as the playoffs approach here on Locked On Grizzlies. Stay with us. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am Joe Mullinax, one of your hosts, joined by Damichael Cole, my wonderful co-host on this program. We are getting playoff ready ourselves after a couple of weeks, after a hard-working March where we were able to take a couple Fridays off. But we're in the end game now, Damichael. We're getting into the postseason. No more days off here. We're going to keep grinding along either as a duo or Damichael one time, solo, me, solo. You can expect through the playoffs to get Locked On Grizzlies each and every day, wherever you get your podcasts or on YouTube. Hopefully you're checking us out there as well. We talked about Ja Morant. We talked about Steven Adams in terms of players that matter most to the upcoming playoff push, including, obviously, Portland Trail Blazers and the games to come over the next several days. This final one, I'm going to let you go first because I feel like I always go first on these things, the way that we have it organized.
There we go.
I'm going to let you go first. Talk about who you think is number 3, because I know that we disagree a bit on this, and it's not necessarily that we disagree and I think that you're wrong or you think I'm wrong.
Team's just good.
Correct. So there's different names that you can place in these spots, and maybe you can share your because I feel like everybody can agree on Ja and Steven Adams. So maybe in the comments, you could list your number 3 if you agree with Damichael, myself, or you have somebody else that you think is the number 3 most important piece. Put it in the YouTube comments in particular. But anyway, who's your number 3, Damichael, looking at this roster and approaching the postseason?
Yeah. And before I get to that, let's preface it with basically what you were just saying a little bit there. There are a lot of players who are coming off the bench, really good players who are very impactful that we won't pretty much get to discuss. But we've talked about a lot in other ways. But right now we're talking about the top guys. And in the playoff, that's kind of a separator. You don't really win NBA championship because you have the best bench in the NBA.
No.
You win the championship because you got Steph Curry, KD, Draymond, and Klay Thompson. That's why the pieces. I mean, I Grizzlies fans. I know you don't want me to use the Golden State example, but look, I have to. Right? They're the perfect example over the last decade where they've had just pretty much 3 or 4 guys just stay around, and everything around those guys has changed, but they've still been able to win. That's kind of what the Grizzlies are going to turn into over the course of time. But no longer ado, I will say my third guy, and quite frankly, he's not even the third most important. He's just the third guy we're going to talk about here. It's Jaren Jackson Jr. from Joe. And it's the two-way potential here is just he is an absolute game changer. Offensively, he's realizing how dominant he can be. I said it on here before when I asked him, like, do you understand? Like, do you feel like guys can't guard you? He said, I feel like that every game. I said, there it is. Haven't heard him say that before.
Right.
It's clicking. He's now knowing, you give me the ball, I'm going to destroy these dudes. As bad as the Grizzlies, played in that second half against Chicago, Jaren had 31 points while being in foul trouble.
Dominant.
5 3-pointers.
Yeah.
So, I mean, he is figuring it out. And you mentioned, Giannis Light and things like that. Like, that's no exaggeration. The two-way potential on this guy. We're talking about a guy who is probably going to win Defensive Player of the Year. He's going to finish in the top 2 regardless. And I've only talked about his offense so far. Like, that goes. I think the two-way potential here. He's a game changer on defense, and now he's becoming a game changer on offense to the point where Ja Morant himself has said he's not the number 1 option anymore because Jaren Jackson Jr. has stepped up to the point where in the fourth quarter, the Grizzlies are giving him the ball. They're moving out of the way. You're seeing it more. They're throwing him the ball on the block, and everyone else is going to the other side of the floor. Like, he's getting that type of respect now, and I think that alone, when you talk about the postseason, when you got to go against all these great guards who like to get to the rim, these great big men in the Western Conference, Jaren Jackson Jr. is going to be a complete game changer and an eraser for this team.
Yeah, he's going to be really, really important. And again, as you alluded to a moment ago, all of these guys are important. There's going to be names that we don't say. Excuse me. There's going to be names that we don't say that are going to be extremely important too. But Jaren Jackson Jr. is a two-way player, extremely vital. I'd love to see him and Ja do more in the two-man game. So that, to me, jumps out as something that needs to improve. I am going to say Desmond Bane as the number 3. And again, Jaren, I'm not disagreeing that Jaren's that important.
Yeah.
And again, you could easily put both Jaren and Bane in front of Steven Adams. We're just talking about what Adams does to amplify, as I said earlier.
Exactly.
He makes all of these guys better. So, and he hasn't been there in a while because of the injury. I'm saying Desmond Bane because Desmond Bane has become a true 3-level scorer in the National Basketball Association. And Bane does something that Jaren does not do offensively. He passes the basketball. Jaren is one of the worst. And I am not.
Yeah, you're right.
I'm not a brilliant man. Okay. I'm not a brilliant person. I'm sure that there are plenty of NBA people that see what I see and see what you probably see and see what the numbers tell us. He has one of the worst assist percentages in the National Basketball Association. When he gets the ball, he's going to score. He's going to try to score. He's going to attack. He's going to shoot. He's going to do one of those things. And to your point, he's usually either defended by somebody that's too small and he's able to get to the basket and get to his shot, or he's defended against somebody that is, or by somebody that is too slow. He's able to get his shot on the perimeter, create off the dribble, but he hasn't added the facilitation level of his game yet. And that makes him predictable. If I was an opposing coach, I would blitz him every time and see if he panics, because he is not a guy that is going to look for the open shooter consistently. There were numerous times against the Bulls where he would have the ball, drive to the basket. They would leave Luke Kennard. They would leave him because they know Jaren is going to shoot. So once Jaren is in a position to actually make that pass, like Desmond Bane does, he will achieve an even higher level offensively, because they're not going to double him anymore because they know he's willing to make that pass. Bane is a capable ball handler, capable creator off the dribble for himself and for others. He is able to play alongside Luke Kennard. You know, you and others have talked about, and I will pat up. Hold on, haven't done this in a while. Pat myself on the back. Who brought up the idea of Bane and Kennard together? Me and other people. Excuse me. So the fact that they can play together, the fact that Tyus, in an upset, again, I'll be honest, when I'm not as correct, I thought I would play Bane and Kennard together with Tyus out. But the Tyus, Bane, Kennard lineup has done really well too. So, and that's mildly surprising considering the potential defensive issues there. So I think that the more ball creators, the more spacers, the more that you have somebody that is able to help others get their offense too, not just themselves. As you enter the playoffs, that's extremely valuable. So all the reasons that you said Jaren matters are 100% accurate. I think I would go Bane in this particular situation because of his ability to make Santi Aldama more relevant in a playoff series, because of his ability to make David Roddy. You know, Roddy can create off the dribble in theory, but he's a rookie. He's going into the playoffs. You can maybe count on him a little bit more just to be a stationary guy in the corner, especially Santi, kick it to that guy and they can knock down a three. Bane is going to find the open man. I'm not sure Jaren is. That's why I would go Bane.
It's a solid point. And I'll say this, in the way that you talk about Bane impacting the game offensively, I think we can say that Jaren Jackson Jr. defensively covers up the Tyus Jones, the Jaws, Dez in a way, sometimes kind of to the same, and possibly even more so, because the Grizzlies get beat off the dribble a little bit. We talk about why Jaren Jackson Jr. is getting all these blocks. The under-discussed point in all of this is because a lot of guys are getting beat off the dribble, and he's having to cover it up. But with that being said, Des, I agree. That him stepping into this playmaking role more has really helped the Grizzlies as a whole to kind of not rely on Ja Morant as much. That's why Ja is having to figure this thing out, because he can give the ball to Dez and play off to the side now, where in the past it was, Ja, you got to do something, and we're going to play off of you. And now he can say, hey, Dez, like we've seen with great duos in the past, right? Michael Jordan was able to give the ball to Scottie Pippen and say, okay, your turn. Or LeBron was able to give it to D Wade and say, you got it now, and so forth. Like, that's something that you have to be able to have, at certain parts of the game, and the Grizzlies have that. But I think you can't go wrong with either of those guys. You can't go wrong with Steven Adams. And, there are guys off the bench. We've seen what Luke Kennard has done. You can make some arguments. We know you love Luke Kennard. There are some guys you can make an argument for. But at the end of the day, I think those four are kind of, separated. We haven't mentioned the name Dillon Brooks, surprisingly. And that's,
has been important.
Dillon Brooks, you talk about in the postseason. We've said it a lot. You look at the four teams right now who are battling in that 5 to 8 range. I mentioned it on the last episode. But if you look at those teams, you got the Clippers, who have Kawhi Leonard and potentially will have Paul George. You got the Lakers, who have LeBron James. You got the Warriors, who have Steph Curry. And you got the Pelicans, who have Brandon Ingram. All those are guys that you're going to need Dillon Brooks to guard. So you can make an argument for him as well.
And it's to your point that you've made all season that Ja Morant matters a lot. All
Yeah.
5 of those starters matter a lot. And if you are able to get them healthy, going back to talking about Steven Adams,
Yeah.
if you can go into the playoffs with those 5 dudes as your starters, and then a Tyus Jones, Luke Kennard, Santi Aldama, David Roddy, kind of, 9-man rotation more than likely, right? Xavier Tillman as well. That'll be a topic for another episode. However that playoff rotation plays out, that will be their best shot to make a run. If they're healthy, they have a chance. They can get to the Western Conference Finals. They can get to the NBA Finals. No one in the Western Conference is scary, right? And there's good and bad to that. That's good because the Grizzlies can make a run. That's bad because, in theory, they could lose in the first round because nobody's going to fear the Memphis Grizzlies. So I think that's an interesting angle that we can continue to dive into and talk about as we proceed to give you what you need here on Locked On. Yeah, I still got it. Thank you so much for making Locked On Grizzlies your first listen today. It is much appreciated. Make sure you're going and checking out the wonderful work that is being done over at Game to Game. Next, highly recommend that you check out Game to Game. They are covering every moment, every top performance, every result over at Game to Game NBA. Locked On Game to Game covers every game from across the association with local analysis that only Locked On can deliver. Follow Game to Game on Locked On NBA, available on the Odyssey app, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. No disrespect to the Portland Trailblazers. If you were tuning into this episode expecting a Portland Trailblazers preview, Damichael, I know you know this. They've punted, right? Like they're over this season. They're done with it. So
it's Shaden Sharp season out there right now.
Doesn't mean that they're not capable of beating people, because this past weekend, that's exactly what happened, and the Grizzlies need to take them seriously. But the moment that Memphis is able to take care of this game, it's going to be over because Portland wants it to be. So anyway, no disrespect to them, but we thought we would kind of cover the current state of the roster. They do play the Trailblazers tonight. We'll talk about that on our next episode of Locked On Grizzlies. It's a back-to-back. It's the last home game tonight for the Grizzlies against the Trailblazers. We'll take a look at the Pelicans game on Wednesday, which carries a little bit more weight to it in terms of the playoff picture. So a review and preview will be the focus of our next episode, Damichael.
Yeah, and we got so much to hit on because we're at the point now where you just said it. The games will be, everything around the games are what matters the most now. We're eyeing the standings. What are the Kings, who just lost to the Spurs, by the way? What are these teams doing? Around the Grizzlies. What are the Grizzlies? How are they peaking? Is everyone playing their best basketball? Is everyone healthy? Those are
everybody playing. Right?
Is everybody playing first and foremost? Like that's what matters the most at this point. The games will tend to become second nature until we get to that postseason part.
Absolutely. So that'll be Wednesday's episode of Locked On Grizzlies. But for today, thank you for hanging out with Damichael and I. Thank you for checking us out over on YouTube. Like, comment, rate, review, subscribe, wherever you get your podcasts. It's all good and much appreciated. We will see you next time. Until then, for Damichael, I'm Joe. Stay locked in, Grizzlies fans. This is Locked On Grizzlies.